Senator Sam
Colonel North
Nunn
may
from
have been
Georgia.
covered during these proceedings, and I may have missed it, but I have never heard the answer to a question that I think is rather important before we get testimony from Admiral Poindexter, and that is, to the best of your knowledge, was Admiral Poindexter aware that Director Casey of the CIA knew about what we've called diversion, what you've called residual fund for the Contras?
In
other words, we know that Admiral Poindexter knew.
Yes, sir.
We know that Director Casey knew by your testimony. Now, the question I have, did Admiral Poindexter, was he aware that Director Casey knew about the residual funds?
I believe that he did know that he being Admiral Poindexter, knew that I had talked at length with Director Casey about it, although I don't recall the specific discussion with the Admiral.
You think that he knew, but you don't recall a specific discussion?
No, sir, I do not. But
it would be your general impression, your best recollection is that he would have known?
Yes, sir. That I would have told him that I had told and talked to Director Casey at length about it.
And of course, Director Casey knew that Admiral Poindexter knew. Is that right?
Yes, sir, he did.
Colonel, there's an article that just came to my attention this morning, as a matter of fact, in the Los Angeles Times, dated July the 11th, 1987. And just so you and your counsel could take a look at it, I'm going to quote one paragraph in here, and I'll send it to you and let you take a look at it. It's a rather short article, and it says, the caption is, Robertson says North told him of Iran hostage talks. Going down to a paragraph which I have circled in label 1, quoting from the article, and this is a quote of Reverend Robertson. Quote, "We just happened to bump into each other," Robertson said about his encounter with North on September 13, 1985, at a private air terminal in Washington. He just happened to say, "I'm going to Iran to meet some of the leadership to try to negotiate the release of some of our hostages," end quote. My question, Colonel North, do you recall that conversation with Reverend Robertson?
I do not, sir. I would also note that it goes on and it said that North asked the Reverend Robertson to pray for me. I have done that often, and am grateful for the prayers of many. I do not recall that conversation. I also note that if it was September 13th, 1985, it is well before we had made those plans. I don't believe that we actually addressed plans to go to Tehran until February of '86.
So you wouldn't have been going to Iran at that time?
Sir, I only went once, and that was in May of '86, and my recollection is that those plans were laid down actually for 2 trips in February of 1986 during our first meetings face-to-face with the Iranian government officials.
So really this is an erroneous article, and Reverend Robertson's memory is not correct on this point.
Well, I'm not even sure that that's a quote from Reverend Robertson.
Well, if it is, I don't know either, but I'm just judging. If it is an accurate quote, it's in error.
It is in error, sir.
Thank you. Colonel North, I think the thing that has impressed this committee members, most of them, many of them, and the American people, more than anything else by your 5.5 days of testimony, is the unequivocal statement that you made at the beginning, and you've backed it up throughout with your testimony, where you state, "I never carried out a single act, not one, Mr. Niels, in which I did not have the authority from my superiors. I haven't been in the 23 years that I've been in the uniformed service of the United States. I haven't in the 23 years that I've been in the uniformed service of the United States of America ever violated an order, not one," end quote. That was a very impressive statement, and you backed it up in your testimony. My problem at this stage is how we reconcile some of this with some of the previous testimony, and I would like to give you an opportunity to do that, because I think if there's one thing that most people agree with in this country is that people at the lower end of the overall chain of command should not take the blame for problems that originated in orders that were carried out in good faith from those above them. We're going to hear from Mr. McFarland this afternoon, and I want to go over just briefly with you a few of the things that appear to me to at least be on the face be contradictions between your testimony and his previous testimony. Mr. McFarland testified he had no knowledge of your activities with the private group raising funds for the Contras. Specifically, quoting from his testimony, Mr. Lyman asked him, were you involved at all in the activities of the Channel Group to obtain monies from the Contras? Mr. McFarland replied, no, I wasn't. Mr. Lyman went on, did you know that Colonel North was involved with them? Mr. McFarland answered, no, I didn't. Now, could I ask you, Colonel North, if Mr. McFarland is correct on that point, or was he in error?
Senator Nunn, I have over 5.5 days in some very difficult testimony testified as to what I did and the authorities that I had to do it as I understood them. One of the most difficult positions that a person can be in is to be in a situation where they are forced to contradict the testimony of anyone. I believe that within the volumes, as Mr. Lyman has described them, of documents that were taken from my office, is ample evidence that I sought approval from my superiors, that I kept them fully informed, and that I did nothing without permission. And I want that made very clear. I did not come here to impugn the testimony of others. I did not come here to contradict others. But I have told you honestly and straightforwardly what I did. Some of it has been very, very unpleasant for me, as I'm sure you know, and very difficult.
Did you get authority from Mr. McFarland for the activities in fundraising?
There was never a speech that I made or a presentation I made that I didn't get approval to actually conduct that.
Let me go on. Mr. McFarland testified that he did not know that you went to Florida in July of 1985 on a government plane to meet with Calero, Bermudez, and Secord concerning the airlift. The specific testimony, Mr. Lyman says, were you aware, sir, that Colonel North was holding that meeting or attending that meeting? Mr. McFarland, no, I wasn't. Do you remember getting authority from Mr. McFarland on that or informing him of that?
Yes, sir, I do.
So that statement is in error.
1985?
July of 85?
Yes, sir.
So you had authority on that?
Yes, sir.
Mr. McFarland testified also that he did not know that you had asked General Secord to undertake the airlift effort. Quoting from that testimony, Mr. Lyman said, did he ever tell you that he was turning to General Secord to undertake that mission? Mr. McFarland, no, he didn't. Now, do you recall consulting or letting Mr. McFarland know what you were doing in that regard?
Yes, sir.
So that's in error.
Those are your conclusions.
I think it's unfair to ask.
I withdraw the last question.
Thank you.
Mr. McFarland testified that he did not know that you had instructed Ambassador Tams to open up the southern front. Did you inform Mr. McFarland that you were asking Ambassador Tams to open up the southern front?
Yes, sir.
So you had specific authority from Mr. McFarland in respect to the airlift and General Secord's participation therein?
Everything that I have testified to, Senator Nunn, is exactly the way it happened. Everything.
One other point I wanted to ask along this line, is it clear in your mind that you never received instructions from Mr. McFarland in regard to soliciting contributions. I believe that he testified very clearly, I won't read all of it, that he did give instructions to his staff in the NSC not to in any way solicit contributions for the countries.
And I never solicited contributions.
I understand that, but the question really is, you made that very clear, did you get those instructions from him? Do you remember receiving those instructions?
I may have been told to separate myself from dollar operations, or however one calls it, but I was very much of the understanding that I personally would not sit and solicit. Every single activity that I conducted, as I described them to this committee, I conducted with the authority of my superiors. And to this day, Senator Nunn, I do not believe any of them to be illegal. I didn't then, I don't now.
I understand that completely. Turning to another subject, and this gets to the testimony you gave, I believe, last Wednesday. You expressed grave reservations, and this goes to the time frame at the end of 1985 or early 1986. Quoting you, page 33 of your testimony, grave reservations about the state of the negotiations at that point with the Iranians, so forth, relating to the overall initiative. You stated, quote, "In that meeting I expressed our grave reservations as to how the structure, which at that point in time focused on several thousand tows, would result in what we wanted. And what we wanted were laid out very clearly in the January findings," end of quote. Do you recall?
Yes, the meeting I am referring to, I believe, and I'd have to look at the testimony, but certainly my recollection is the meeting I was referring to was a meeting with the Iranians, probably Mr. Ghorbanifar.
Right, that's correct.
And that was probably the January 20th or 17th or 30th or whatever that meeting was at the end of January.
Of 86.
Yes, sir.
Of 86. Was Mr. Neer at that meeting? Mr. Neer at that meeting?
Yes, he was.
Now, when you say you had grave reservations at that time, Colonel North, about the plan and whether it would achieve the findings, which findings did you have reservations about the likelihood of achievement at that stage?
The January 6th or 17th finding.
Was that where the President set forth his goals of, I believe you described it as a strategic breakthrough in relations with Iran as one goal, end the Iran-Iraq war as another goal, and get the hostages back as a third goal?
If you're not asking me to quote directly from a finding I don't have in front of me, yes, and to rescue American hostages, I believe was also.
I listed that as a third goal.
Yes, sir.
Now, you were having reservations at that, sir.
There is a vote pending in the House of Representatives, and members of the House will have to leave. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At that time, you had reservations about the likelihood of achieving those three goals. Is that what you're saying here in this quote?
Well, the concerns I had was that we weren't getting to meet with the Iranian officials that we sought to meet face to face with. And I was instructed to express those concerns, and I did so.
Well, you stated here you had grave reservations as to how this would result in achieving what you were trying to achieve in the January finding. So you were concerned that the way it was going, you weren't going to be able to achieve those goals, or it really wasn't going the way you had hoped. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, then you testified at that same meeting, Mr. Ghorbanifar, quote, took me into the bathroom and suggested several incentives to make the February transaction work. And the attractive incentive for me was the one he made, that residuals could flow to support the Nicaraguan resistance, end quote. You recall that testimony?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned several incentives. Do you recall any of the other incentives besides?
I recall one specifically.
We've gotten that one, is that right?
No, in addition. And that was Mr. Ghorbanifar offered me $1 million if we could make this prosper.
To you personally?
Yes, sir.
So he offered a bribe to you right there on the spot?
Yes, sir.
And tell us what you said in response to that.
It was out of the question.
You told him you would not accept any financial favors at that point?
Could not, would not, and that if those kinds of discussions pursued, that he would be out of the picture very quickly. And it was then that he came up with what I considered to be a far better idea.
So were there any other incentives besides the two that we now know about?
He talked in terms of other operations that his people, whoever they were, could provide in terms of support for the United States.
All right, when you came back after that meeting, at that stage he'd put something on the table that was of real interest to you.
Not the $1 million.
Not the $1 million. I got that very clearly. When you came back, did you report to your superiors about the $1 million bribe offer?
No, we knew what Ghorbanifar Farr was, and everybody involved in it knew what backsheesh is, and it was expected.
Did you tell anyone else?
Actually, it wasn't expected. It was not unexpected.
Did you tell General Secord or anyone of that conversation?
I don't believe General Secord was with me at that meeting. I think I may have described it to one of the CIA officers. I honestly don't remember.
All right, but you didn't report it to any of your superiors when you came back?
I may have. I don't recall, sir.
Now, the real point I want to get to is when you came back, obviously, your perspective had changed somewhat. You were not very optimistic at that stage about achieving those original finding goals. But you've become more optimistic and more enthused because of the new incentive of being able to create a residual.
And, well, I want to go back just one moment to clear up the record if there's confusion. The original proposal for the creation of residuals came from Mr. Neer, and that was to conduct other operations and to replenish the Israeli tows that had been shipped the year before.
Correct, right. I think you...
In January, later in January, at the meeting and I can find out, I think it was either London or Frankfurt, I'm sure, when Mr. Ghorbanifar suggested his incentives, he also coupled that with a promise of a meeting in February with Iranian officials. And so for those two reasons, the promise of a meeting with Iranian officials and the attractiveness of what I saw as the use of residuals to support the resistance, I came back and advocated that we pursue the initiative.
Well, at that point, did you make it plain to Admiral Poindexter, who I believe was in charge of, he was your superior at that time, did you make it plain to him that one of the main reasons you were more enthused at this stage was based on the residual possibility?
Yes, I mean, I'm sure that I told him, look, the meeting in London has resulted in two things, if not several other arrangements that were logistically improved in terms of how you do things. But those two principal factors, I'm confident that I did or we wouldn't have proceeded.
Could you repeat those just for clarity here?
Two factors?
Yes.
One, the use of residuals to support the Nicaraguan resistance, and number two, the promise of a meeting, direct face-to-face meeting with Iranian officials, which indeed took place.
And you're clear that you told Admiral Poindexter that. Did you tell him orally or in writing or both, or do you recall?
I do not recall, but I'm confident.
There's no doubt you told him about both of those at that stage.
There's no doubt in my mind.
All right. Wouldn't you think at that stage, Colonel North, that Admiral Poindexter had an acute obligation to share that with the President of the United States?
Well, it's kind of like the other question you asked me, Senator. I have testified again as to what I knew and what I assumed others knew and what others told me to do. You're asking me to put myself in Admiral Poindexter's
well, let me rephrase that question then.
Excuse me.
May I rephrase the question?
Yes, sir.
Counsel?
I don't know whether you saw the red light, sir.
I did, and I have a secret signal up here with the chairman. He gave me 2 more minutes.
Okay.
We had it worked out. Thank you for helping us. Colonel North, did you expect, it seems to me that was a very important kind of new dimension to the original finding, both of those matters, both of those two things. I think they were very important. You properly told Admiral Poindexter. Didn't you expect that the President of the United States would be informed about those two new incentives?
Yes. Again, as I said, I had expectations throughout my tenure that when it was appropriate that my superiors solicit and obtain the President's permission to do things, that they had done so. And I proceeded throughout my tenure that way.
Thank you. I think that was an appropriate assumption because it seems to me it was enormously important since the original finding the principal operation officer out there had become less optimistic about the original goals of that January finding, and the principal operations officer had become more enthusiastic because of two new incentives. It seems to me that there was an imperative obligation on Admiral Poindexter to convey that to the President of the United States. That's all. Colonel North, thank you for your patience. I want to thank your wife also for her patience during this proceeding. I know she's been there the whole time, and she has been very loyal to you, and I'm sure that you're enormously grateful for that.
Amen.
We thank you.
Senator, in no way. It is our guest probably causing some relief among members of the committee, at least to their backsides, because they have been sitting there all this time. Colonel North has been quite extraordinarily, or has seemed quite extraordinarily refreshed throughout much of this. He and his wife, a military officer's wife, pointed out to us the other day that Mrs. North sits exactly as military wives are supposed to sit, with their knees, their legs crossed at the ankles. At any rate, she has been extremely still and very supportive, as Senator Nunn said there, and he has looked quite extraordinarily fresh throughout. And there he goes again. Less security today, which of course must be reassuring to all of us. You will recall that a couple of days ago, as he came and went, he really was buried between or inside a phalanx of some of the heaviest or the largest security people we'd ever seen for some time. And
live coverage of the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North at the Iran-Contra hearings continues. Here is Peter Jennings.
just before we call in Britt Hume again on Capitol Hill, a couple of what we might call housekeeping notices. Senator Inouye, the chairman of the committee, has told Robert McFarlane that he can expect to reappear before the committee this afternoon at about 4 o'clock. He was the National Security Advisor from October 1983 until December of 1985. And in the last questioning there, particularly Senator Nunn, we thought, there was some laying of the groundwork for what is very clearly some public contradiction between Colonel North's testimony and Mr. McFarlane's. There was, I don't know if you have the slightest bit of curiosity about this, but there was, and has been on a number of days here, some emphasis by Colonel North particularly on how the whole world is listening to these hearings and that the United States is suffering some considerable embarrassment by washing its laundry in this fashion. So we try to find out just where it is being seen. It turns out it's a pretty hot item in Lebanon. On the Christian television station, Ali Mania apparently has gripped television viewers. Now, I must tell you that at night in Lebanon, you don't have too much to do except stay indoors, so any television's pretty good. But Ali Mania is apparently very popular, particularly in eastern Lebanon among the Christian community. It has been seen throughout Europe, but usually in lengthy excerpts. The Italians ran some live clips for a while, but most people have been running excerpts. The Soviets have run some. The cable news network is seen in about 54 countries in a variety of ways, very often in hotels, if those of you who know and have traveled abroad. And the Voice of America is sending special broadcasts to the Middle East, to Europe, and to Africa every other hour with as much as 20 minutes testimony. And in Nicaragua, in fact, in the office of Daniel Ortega, they are doing special supplements every day, and it is seen on the Nicaraguan television every night, as we learned last night from ABC's Peter Collins down there, with a clear slant to it. In fact, somebody suggested yesterday you couldn't have Ollie without Ronnie, and this was not a government within a government, said the Nicaraguan spokesman, because this was the way the Reagan government operated all the time. So that is how at least part of the rest of the world is responding to all this. Britt Hume, are you there on Capitol Hill?
I am indeed, Peter, and with me is Senator Warren Rudman, who is the vice chairman of the Senate committee and a very active figure in this investigation. I'd like to ask you, Senator, just before the break, as Peter Jennings just mentioned, Senator Nunn ticked off a number of specifics where it appears that Mr. McFarlane and Colonel North do not agree. Some of them are very important. Are we about to see here this afternoon a direct and major clash suggesting that one or the other, or perhaps both of these men, was lying?
Yeah, I would not characterize it as lying. I would make the general comment that there is conflict in testimony. It could be failed recollection, it could be different circumstances, there could be a variety of issues involved, but there will be conflict in the testimony.
Well, Senator, let me ask you this. You indicated yesterday that you feel that Colonel North has, by and large, been truthful. Could you give me some sense, or give us some sense, of why you think that's so?
Well, the major reason I think it's so, Brett, is because for some months now, as I stated yesterday, we have had a number of documents indicating that he had informed his superiors of a whole line of things that he did. It came as no surprise to me that this man was being unfairly held out as someone who did it all by himself. Now, he did some things that were wrong, but he did many of them, in fact, all of them that I can recount with authority. That's the basic
So when
issue.
he says, as he did again here earlier this afternoon, that I acted with the authority of my superiors in every instance, you're saying that all this documentation that you've had an opportunity to go through, which has been so voluminous, as tall as he is apparently, indicates that that is in fact so.
Yes, but I have to give you this exception. Senator Nunn touched a number of what I would call operational details that Senator Nunn asks questions about. North answers yes or no, and there'll be conflict with McFarland. But I would not elevate it to the height of anybody lying or committing perjury. But it goes to show you, in many ways, how confused this operation was as to what authority there was for what from superior and subordinate.
Senator Rudman, it's Peter Jennings in
Yes,
New York.
Peter.
I was struck by something else, I must confess, and I'd like to know if you have the same reaction. When Colonel North suddenly said that Mr. Ghorbanifar had offered him a bribe of $1 million if the deal prospered, and we never heard about that before, and he waited to be asked before volunteering it, I kept wondering to myself, gosh, is there a lot more there? What did you think?
Well, I'm not sure how much more there is there. I'm not sure what else we can ask Colonel North. That came, frankly, not as a shock to those of us who are familiar with Ghorbanifar. We had not asked him that directly. Peter, you might note that he did hint at other things a few days ago, which is one of the reasons I think Senator Nunn asked the question. But it proves again what a corrupt group of people we were working with trying to conduct American foreign policy.
Come up. We had some discussion about this in the executive session. And of course, we cannot here go into detail as to any emergency plans for continuation of government that we might have in this country in the event of nuclear attack. And I'm not asking that we go into that. I have had discussion with White House counsel over the last 2 days about this matter because great concern has been voiced by the American people since some of the stories appeared in the news media to the effect that there was a plan to have martial law to suspend the Constitution in the event of civil dissent, civil disorder. And White House counsel's office has indicated it would be appropriate, as long as we do not get into a general discussion of emergency plans dealing with nuclear attack, to put a couple of questions to you about this, as long as I refer to matter that's been printed in the media and is in the public domain. So I would like to do that. Staff would hand you a copy of an article in the Miami Herald, appeared on Sunday, June the 5th, 1987. It was carried in several other newspapers in the country on the wire, and I ask this because it has caused grave concern in the country, and I admit it caused grave concern to me when I read these reports. Let me just quote one paragraph that is there marked. It says, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, for example, helped draw up a controversial plan to suspend the Constitution in the event of national crisis, such as nuclear war, violent and widespread internal dissent, or national opposition to a U.S. military invasion abroad. And I would ask you, did you participate in or advocate any such plan to suspend the Constitution in the event of national crisis such as nuclear war, violent and widespread internal dissent, or national opposition to U.S. military invasion abroad?
Absolutely not.
To your knowledge, has the government of the United States adopted any such plan, or does it have in place, in being, any such plan?
No, sir. None.
Well, I felt it important to ask those questions of you. Let me say the intelligence committees will be in the process of being briefed. We've had periodic briefings on our emergency plans in terms of nuclear attack in the past. We intend to have additional briefings on the status of these plans, and that would be the appropriate place for those briefings to take place. But I felt it very important that we put those questions to you and put them into the public record in light of the concern that had been expressed to me about them.
I thank you, Senator Bourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Adino. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd hoped that it would not be necessary for me to come back today, but I had assumed yesterday when the chairman decided that I was not to continue that I had 5 extra minutes allotted to me by Mr. Aspen. But nonetheless, not to take any further time. Colonel North, I have just a few questions, and I'm sure that you can answer them probably either yes or no. They're very simple questions. These committees have heard evidence that DEA agents worked with you in your efforts to locate and free the hostages held in Lebanon. My question, did you brief the Attorney General on that activity?
It is my recollection that I did personally brief the Attorney General. I don't recall the specific meeting. In the records I turned over to the committee, there is reference to that briefing, and I believe in the documents that the committee was provided by the White House.
Does it identify the date, Colonel?
I do not recall that, but we did discuss that, I believe, in perhaps it was executive session. But my recollection is that I personally briefed the Attorney General on it.
Thank you. Did you tell the Attorney General that private funds were going to be used to bribe foreign officials and others to locate and free the hostages?
That is my recollection, sir.
Did the Attorney General ever tell you that it would not be proper for you to use government funds to bribe foreign officials and others, but that it would be acceptable to use private money for that purpose?
Let me just clarify one point in this. First, to answer who told me what, my recollection is that Director Casey and the Director of Operations at CIA had both indicated that U.S. government monies could not be used for those purposes. And I don't recall asking the Attorney General whether or not it was appropriate to use U.S. monies. It may well have been that the DEA officers themselves made it known that those monies, U.S. government monies, couldn't be used for those purposes. I also want to specify it was not, when you say bribing foreign officials, I'm not entirely certain that they were foreign officials.
Foreigners.
Foreigners, yes, sir. But in any event, I came to understand, by virtue of my discussions, certainly with Director Casey, I think with the Director of Operations at Langley, possibly with officers in the FBI with whom I worked on counterterrorism, that we couldn't use U.S. government monies for those purposes and that we would use outside monies.
But the Attorney General, as you recollect, did not advise you.
I do not believe the Attorney General recommended one way or the other on that, sir.
My last question on this subject. Did you tell the Attorney General that expenses for the DEA agents were paid for from private sources such as Albert Hakim, Richard Miller, and Adolfo Calero?
I honestly don't recall the full nature of that discussion. I do know that in a memorandum I did for Admiral Poindexter on this, that I did specify where the source of funds was coming from, and I believe I probably told the Attorney General that. But I do not recall the conversation with specificity.
One final question, Colonel. In your response to Mr. Niels the other day, with reference to a question concerning a meeting on November the 21st, you made some reference to the Attorney General. And let me read you the statement. And so that is early on November 21st, these are your words, before this committee.
Which year are we talking about, sir?
We're talking about a statement that you made the other day before this committee with reference to the meeting of November the 21st of 1986.
Okay.
And your answer to Mr. Niels, and so that is early on November 21st, because I believe the decision to make an inquiry to have the Attorney General, and then you added, and this is what I'm confused about, or Mr. Meese, in his role as a friend of the President, conduct a fact-finding excursion on what happened in September and November in 1985. I assure the Admiral you were talking about, don't worry, it is all taken care of. My question, when you refer to Mr. Meese as a friend of the President, why do you use that term?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what I meant in those terms. What I clearly intended to say was that no one told me then, and it was not until 4 days later, on the 25th, that there was any criminal investigation or criminal concern in this whole issue. And my recollection is that the Admiral told me that morning, or that day at some point, that there was going to be a fact-finding inquiry conducted by Mr. Meese, not in his role as chief law enforcement officer or as Attorney General, but because he was close to the President. He was a person the President relied upon to be able to get to the bottom of all this.
In other words, your answer then is that Admiral Poindexter said to you that Mr. Meese would be coming to conduct an inquiry, but he would be coming as a friend of the President.
Yeah, again, I'm making the characterization. I don't believe Admiral Poindexter said he's coming as the friend of the President. My recollection of the discussion...
You just used those terms.
I understand, but I'm saying that was my characterization, not the Admiral's characterization. Does that answer the question? I mean, what I'm saying to you, Mr. Rodino, is that I characterized it after the fact as that kind of an inquiry. At the point in time, I would guess, and I don't recall the specifics of it.
Is there any reason why you wanted to characterize
it?
Yes,
I want to make it very clear that I had absolutely no inkling of criminal investigations, criminal inquiry, criminal behavior, anything criminal until the 25th of November, 1986. I mean, when the Admiral told me that, it was, in fact, I don't even think he said the Attorney General was coming. It was the Attorney General was going to send some people over, or Mr. Meese is going to send some of his people over, one of those kinds of things. But the characterization I gave it in my discussion with Mr. Niels was my characterization, not the Admiral's.
You assumed that he would be coming as a friend to make a friendly inquiry?
What I'm saying is, I assumed he was coming not as a criminal investigator. No mention was made to me when the officers arrived in my office on Saturday morning, the 22nd. Nobody said, we're going to conduct a criminal inquiry into your behavior, North, or the documents that you've got. It was simply described to me as a fact-finding inquiry. I think those were the 3 words that were used. And I had, as I indicated to you earlier, on Friday, I started laying out the documents. And the characterization I gave Mr. Niels is one that the spin that I put on it, and as I have described it to you here in the committee.
Thank you, Colonel North. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sarbanes.
Mr. Chairman, because of the assertions which will appear on the printed record, questioning the fairness of this committee, I think it's important to place on the printed record a demonstration of committee fairness, which I think has been very visible and obvious to all of us as we have sat through this hearing, and to those who have watched it, and that is that Colonel North's counsel has had unlimited scope throughout these proceedings to defer his responses to questions while they engaged in consultation and counsel. And that has happened frequently and often, and I simply underscore it to place it on the printed record, because although it is very visible, unless a statement is made about it, it will not appear in the printed record, reflecting, I think, a very significant measure of fairness extended to the colonel in his testimony before this committee.
Hyde, do you have any final statement to make, sir?
A very brief one, sir.
Please proceed.
I would simply like to thank the American people who have responded with their good wishes, their support, their prayers through what has been for me and my family a long and difficult ordeal. I thank them for that, and I salute them. That is my statement, sir.
Thank you very much. Colonel North, with all sincerity, I thank you for your assistance these past 6 days. You have been most cordial, and your presence here should make your fellow officers very proud of the way you have presented yourself. And to your lady, I wish her the best. She has sat there throughout these days with patience and grace. You have a fine lady. The panel will stand in recess for 10 minutes.
Is the colonel outside the Senate caucus room?
I just want to once again reiterate what I said inside. I will not be making appearances on television and the like. I think it's important that the American people know how grateful I am and my family for their support and their prayers and their well wishes and their love. I salute them all. Thank you.
Do you see yourself as the new American hero?
Colonel North making it clear that he is not going to continue talking at this moment. But I think that we all know that we have not heard the end of this Marine colonel. And as I think we all know, there are millions of people in the country who would be disappointed if we had heard the end of him.